Is Stagger worth prioritizing in Soulframe? This seems like it should be a relatively easy question to answer, and yet the process of attempting to do so nearly cost me my sanity. Soulframe players seem to be pretty split in their opinions on Stagger as an offensive mechanic. Stability, the armor rating that defends against Stagger, is clearly good because when you don't have enough, enemies will knock you around like a pinball. But the utility of Stagger is a lot less clear. Some people love it while others ignore it entirely. So why do people have such different experiences of the same mechanic? I could not resist my curiosity about this, so I decided to try to find out. Testing Stagger is extremely difficult because we cannot see Stagger numbers in combat. All of our assumptions about how Stagger works comes from one of these four sources. First, we have item cards, which do list how much Stagger a weapon deals, so on some level the devs must know we want this information, and yet this is the only place we see any numerical representation for Stagger mechanics. Next, we have Stagger bars, which fill as an enemy takes Stagger and gradually empty as an enemy stops taking Stagger. Third, we have enemy animations, which seem to respond to how much Stagger enemies take, but as you'll see, there is a lot of room for interpretation. Finally, we have dev streams, specifically this one tidbit from dev stream 12.
Joe's really been working, getting the thresholds in which you stumble and stagger in a better spot.
This was our introduction to stability thresholds, a mechanic that isn't explained or even mentioned anywhere in-game, and everything we think we know about how it works is basically inference based on animations and how many pixels get added to Stagger bars. So, Stagger is an impossibly opaque mechanic that none of us truly understand. At the end of this video, I'll offer some suggestions for how that could change, but for now, here's what I learned from my testing. Stagger seems to be a damage type, just like physical damage and magic damage, and some parts of the game are more clear about this than others. In general, Soulframe would greatly benefit from unified terminology for its interface and game mechanics. I love the poetic prose in lore and item descriptions, but there shouldn't be this much confusion about what basic combat mechanics are called. Anyway, Stagger is a damage type, and Stability is the armor that defends against that damage type. Enemies and envoys alike have a Stagger pool that acts like a separate health bar. I used to think this was a stability bar, and increasing our stability increased that pool, but now I believe that is technically incorrect. Instead, it seems like we have a Stagger pool that acts like a health bar, and stability reduces how much Stagger we take in the same way that physical and magic armor reduce how much physical and magic damage we take. Curiously, Stagger bars seem to work differently for envoys than they do for enemies. When our envoy Stagger bar fills, we get knocked prone, but when an enemy Stagger bar fills, they get Stagger locked. We can still knock enemies prone, but that now seems to be determined by stability thresholds. The combat art that used to give thrown attacks a chance to knock enemies prone now adds Stagger instead, and this temper gives attacks a chance to knock enemies prone. If stability reduces Stagger in the same way that other types of armor reduce damage, that means stability probably gives flat Stagger reduction. If that's true, it could explain why players have vastly different impressions of whether or not Stagger is useful, because Stagger doesn't scale. The amount of Stagger your weapon deals does not seem to scale with any virtue. Instead, it is determined by the weapon itself and can only be directly increased by tempers that add more Stagger. This means that when you're fighting against lower-level enemies, you will deal enough Stagger to bypass enemy stability and thus notice its benefits in combat. But against higher-level enemies, your Stagger will be reduced to a point where it is effectively meaningless. It's essentially the same mechanic that makes an enemy's health bar turn gray when you can't do enough physical or magic damage to bypass its armor. There are ways to increase the effectiveness of Stagger, which I think are basically armor strips for stability. Garen Rude's Behest specifically says it reduces enemy defenses, and it definitely increases how much Stagger enemies take, so it's probably a stability strip. And I'd guess Ode Tempest's Astrosphere applies a stability debuff. The voltaic status effect might also work this way, or it could just increase the amount of incoming Stagger. It's actually impossible to tell for sure what's going on in any of these cases, but given how burning works as an armor strip, I think it's reasonable to guess that voltaic status functions the same way. Totems are the only source of virtue scaling stagger in Preludes 15, and that's what makes them so strong. Breaking an enemy's stagger bar completely ends combat by opening them to a finisher, so if this were all that stagger could do, it would be very difficult to balance stagger in a way that makes it meaningful in combat without being overpowered. But that's not all stagger can do. Stability thresholds exist, and probably determine when you or an enemy get jostled, interrupted, or knocked down, but that's all I can say with confidence because, once again, this is not explained anywhere in-game. Perhaps it's more correct to call these stagger thresholds because I think they look for a certain amount of stagger dealt within a window of time, and how much you deal determines whether the enemy will flinch, get interrupted, or get knocked down. But I don't know how much stagger you have to deal or how long the time window is. Different enemies definitely have different thresholds, but is that because of their stability rating, or does each attack type have a different threshold? It certainly looks like this is Soulframe's poise system, and I could probably figure it out if we could see staggered numbers, but I simply do not have the mental fortitude to attempt to reverse engineer these thresholds without more data. The bottom line is that stagger is a surprisingly complex mechanic, and from what I've been able to piece together, it seems like a pretty good one, but it is too opaque to build around. How am I supposed to know whether or not a temper is good for my build if I can't see what the temper does in any measurable way? Why give me a temper that adds 8 stagger when I have no way to know what 8 stagger does? By comparison, if I had a temper that added 8 damage to my attacks, that might not seem like much, and I probably wouldn't notice enemy health bars vanishing any faster, but I could see my numbers going up and know that it's at least doing something helpful. I could even use the amount of damage increase for different types of attacks to figure out how that damage boost is synergizing with other buffs and abilities. Stagger might be working in the same way, but because I can't see those numbers, the only effects that feel impactful are the ones too big to miss. Being able to interrupt or knock back enemies is unquestionably useful, but because I can't see how much stagger I'm dealing, there's no way to know how much stagger I need to get the effect I want. So, how could DE fix this? Soulframe is a beautiful game, and it would be a shame to clutter it up with a ton of numbers on screen, so my suggestion is a combat log. This could be an opt-in chat window, and the text wouldn't show unless the tab is at the front of the player's chat box. At this point, I'd be happy with literally any amount of information in that log, but if we could actually see how much of each damage type we deal in each attack, and how much of that damage is mitigated by enemy armor, that would not only make building and testing in Soulframe so much more enjoyable and approachable, it would also help us give better quality feedback to the developers. And perhaps part of the feedback they're looking for is whether or not the game is currently telling us enough about how it works, in which case my feedback is no, it is not. There's a certain amount of puzzle solving I really enjoy, but the more complicated a system gets, the better foundation I need in order to figure out what's going on. And right now, Soulframe seems to have a beautiful system hidden in stagger mechanics, but almost no foundation at all for the players to figure out how any of it works. With a bit more clarity and some visible values, even I might end up liking stagger enough to build some bows for it. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Soulframe's most opaque combat mechanic. If you enjoyed this little breakdown, please toss it a like, and subscribe to see more updated Soulframe content. Let me know in the comments whether or not you think about stagger in your builds, and until next time, happy hunting!